Are you ready to learn how to grow your entrepreneurial mindset so that you can not just survive, but thrive now and into the future? This is your show. Welcome to PossibLaw. Let's get into it. Welcome to PossibLaw. I'm super excited to have you on the show today, Nicholas Loise, as we talked about in the beginning. I grew up with in Wisconsin with kind of a funny name, so I try to be mindful about how you pronounce things. But I'm really excited to have you on the show today.
Sal, it's great to be on. Trust me, I've been called far worse than what you've called me, and you would never mispronounce it as horribly as my high school and junior high gym teachers seem to. So, absolutely no problem at all.
Yeah, it's funny. My natural inclination, my wife's middle name is Louise,
Sure.
right? And so like you see it and you're like, okay. But then I'm like, well, it's like missing a letter, so I don't think that's right. But again, I try to think through where it might be. So I always like to start these shows to get to know you kind of beyond the professional. Well, yes, this is a business podcast. We like to talk about how to do better in your business world. I think it's really important to understand that you, the personal, impacts you, the professional. And so I always like to start by asking, what do you like to do when you're not working? Do you have family? Like what impacts your day to day beyond the job?
Sure. Well, thanks for that. The human side of everything, right, is we do business with humans, right? So I think it's important to know. Like yourself, I'm a Chicagoan, right? So love the food scene in Chicago. My wife and I try to hit them all, especially the newer ones. We're empty nester now. I have children. One is 27, the other one is 24, right? So kind of when they were younger, like your children are, we spent a lot of time with them, but also trying to do that. Big on the art scene. Obviously, if you are watching this, you can see I'm a bibliophile. I've got a ton of books behind me, so I do like reading. I always joke that these are the boring business books, and the fun books are downstairs, the fiction and the historical fiction and all that. So, those are the things that we like to do. In the summers, we are blessed to have a second house up in the Michigan, close to Lake Michigan. So we spend as much time as we can there. That's a full family compound where kids are there, grandkids, nephews, everybody, and nieces. So it's a lot of fun and it's low key. But my parents really enjoy having us all there. So we try to get up as much as possible. Because we're empty nesters, we do like to travel, right? So we're gonna dash off to New York between Christmas and New Year's to go see one of our favorite jazz pianists and singers. My wife and I, right, we have the ability to do that, so we're blessed. After that, after New Year's, we're taking the children to Vegas for their Christmas gift, right? They've never been to Vegas, and I think everybody should experience it once, decide if you like it or don't like it. So we do it all, right? That's the fun part of the journey of life is, you do things at different times based on where you're at, and what's tying you down or not tying you down.
I love that. I mean, I've learned that having kind of a multidisciplinary experience actually is so beneficial to everything, right? Definitely work, and because you pull little nuggets out of life and things that you kind of wouldn't expect. And
Sure.
so, I've learned that being willing to open yourself up to all kinds of different experiences is really important. How did you get into art and food, right? I mean, I guess food is kind of obvious in some ways, but you've seemed to taken it a little bit more as like a
Yeah.
job almost. Like I really enjoy seeing these things. My wife and I also try to do like, the Michelin star restaurants and stuff,
Sure. Yeah.
even though we don't. And my wife is an exceptional chef, so she maybe will critique it in a more like substantive way. I just eat and I'm excited about it. But how did you get into that?
Well, probably like you, I'm blessed with a great partner, my wife, right? So she's got a great palate, and she loves trying new things, whether it's the 3-star Michelin's that we have, or even some 1-star or 2 stars, are just the great local places. Being Italian, right? We naturally our language of love, I always say, is food, right? We're kind of around the table growing up. Where a lot of our time is spent with family around the table. So food is a natural byproduct of that. In a past life, I had a marketing firm, and we did a lot of work with restaurants, right? And we did a lot of work with the arts too, quite frankly. And a portion of that certainly we had cash, right, because they would pay us, but we'd also work trade out because their average ticket was a lot lower than maybe the plumbers that work with us or the kitchen remodelers and that. So that was one way to do that. We always want to have the experience with the children too, right? So we wanted them to see that the world is round, not flat, and not have the same things all the time. So we made a point of taking them to the city, made a point of taking them to the museums in the city. We're in Chicago, so we're blessed to have a very robust art scene. I grew up in not only a sports family, right? My dad was really successful playing. I played a little bit, but my brother and sisters and that were more in the arts, right? So we would spend a lot of time on the art side of the business, and so did I in high school, right? So I think you have to be well rounded, right? We're not quite Renaissance men in this day and age, but we should be, right? We should be sculpting and painting, spending as much time on that side of the brain as we are watching, whether it's football, baseball, or basketball. And I think all things are good. But I agree with you. I think you get little Easter eggs by having a very different vantage point by doing a bunch of different things, right? That's why I'm a firm believer of fiction books as much as business books. Business books kind of tell the same story over and over again. Sometimes it's here's my journey, here's how great I am, and hire me. Other times, but I think fiction kind of takes you through the arc of three different stories and people trying to find themselves or not find themselves, or the human struggle has been the human struggle since the dawn of time. And I think we could experience that. I also think it stimulates you as an entrepreneur and a small business owner, and that's the audience that you have, even if they're working for somebody. I think we all are entrepreneurial in our ways, and it stimulates you to think by just getting outside influences or inputs, if you will, right? Just going downtown. This weekend we're recording, I don't know when it's going to be released, but the Magnificent Mile, right, is going to light the tree. And that if you were just down there and the weather was good, you could just see we're all humans. We all want to focus on our family. We all want a better place to live and just do better. And I think a lot of times we get divided. Social media is horrible about that, right? It's a necessary evil. But I think having these different sources of input makes us better output as people.
Two things you said there I love. One is the Easter eggs, because it's funny. I always joke, like, somebody will say something and be like, "How did you even know that?" And I'm like, you know what? I don't actually really know, right? Like, I read it, I saw it,
Yeah,
I experienced it. I was on a podcast with Nick, and he told me this
yeah,
story. I don't know, right? And I think talking about it kind of an Easter egg, something you find a little bit, it is a really good way to talk about it, because I think the more kind of people have become insular in some ways. They've reduced their whole world to this one little echo chamber, right? Of their
yeah,
same opinions, their same people, the same stuff, and you lose some of that ability to pull disparate ideas. And in business, if you actually look out through history, some of the most successful companies on earth basically just stole an idea from another industry and applied it to their industry. And that's the same kind of idea, right? And so it's part of also why I talk on this show a lot, because I'm trying to help legal professionals, not just lawyers, but anybody in the legal industry, learn how to become better about being entrepreneurial and builders, because we get trained to be very conservative and risk adverse. And one of those things is like, what other industries have done stuff, we can probably apply it our way. And so
sure.
learning about that is really interesting, and how you go about that and exposing yourself to all those kinds of different things is difficult. And then the other thing you said there, which I think is important, is I think a lot of people get caught up in this idea that to be good at business or anything, you can only like read business books, or you can only do that thing. When in reality, you kind of have to like let your mind lay fallow. I've heard it talk about where it's like, you go off. I mean, Bill Gates goes to like a cabin now.
Yeah,
He's got like $1 billion cabin somewhere, I'm sure. But like, my point is like, he just sits in like quiet and thinks. And I think not enough people do that. How did you learn that skill? Was it kind of your upbringing of like thinking differently? Again, artists in the family and stuff, or how did that come about?
I don't know. I think it's similar to what you just kind of tipped on, and I think I kind of got it from from studying, like Bill Gates, right? I'm a firm believer. He goes away, I think it's once a quarter or at least once a year to this cabin, right? He loads it up with Diet Coke. And if you watch the Netflix documentary, Bill's Brain, right, he talks about that. It is in that. There's Cal Newport's book, right, about, they not the so good they can never forget about you, but just really focusing on quieting down the mind and just thinking and getting rid of all the noise and just having deep thoughts. If you study the really good artists, sure, they immersed themselves in their art, but then they took time away and they traveled, right? Or they went to see different things. And I think, if you study Leonardo da Vinci, he had so many diverse talents and thoughts and interests that, it just kind of stimulated the mind. So I think it's, I have a little bit of ADHD, right? As all entrepreneurs do, right? I have a little bit of that. So I kind of have to, I bounce around a little bit. I have to quiet the mind. A little bit of dyslexia, right? So sometimes the reading of the fiction is easier for me, right? It's telling a story, it's more engaging. The mind isn't kind of splitting off and looking for to solve a problem. But I read a little bit slower, right? Or I have to kind of read passages once or twice, or I'm big on audiobooks or that type of thing. I was on a board, and a really phenomenal entrepreneur is actually in the Aurora and Naperville area, big family business. He said, every summer I take off and I don't read business books. So I read science books. I try to go deep on that. And I'm like, well, I was young. I was in my 30s, maybe even the early 20s. And he told me this. I'm like, well, if he could do it, he's this successful, I should do that. So I think it's that, right? So we talked a little bit about in my preamble in the beginning, in the summer, right? I don't read any business books. I read either different fiction books or mysteries, or even some of the stuff that are like the top 10 that people are reading that I should have in my knowledge, right? I spend a portion of my business as a marketer, so I should know what people are talking about and what's in vogue. My wife is phenomenal at trying to get me into different hobbies, right? So maybe I dabble a little bit like in bird watching or something like that, because I think she knows I need it, right? And she's smart enough to say, okay, well, when you retire, you got to have something to do, because if not, you're going to be horrible to live with. So, those type of things I think are really important. Every day when I go to the health club, so I'm close. It's a 10-minute drive, 15-minute drive. I think at least in the morning, I try to listen to a different radio station every day, right? So it might even be the Polish station, and I'm not, I can't speak it, or the Spanish station, or the hip hop, or the rap, or something of that nature, because I found myself in that rut of getting in the car, turning on XRT or NPR and driving, right? And driving the same way home. So I force myself at least once a week to take a different way home, so the mind doesn't become myopic, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah, myopic is, I think, something that a lot of people get caught up in because I think we've sort of gone the other way on how like almost ambition is a bad thing. You hear a lot of the like, you work too much and all the rest of it. And I want to be clear, like I am not a proponent of this whole like Silicon Valley 996 thing. Like I don't actually think you need to do that to be successful, but on the opposite side of it, I think it is okay to be ambitious, and I think it's a good thing to be ambitious, and a lot of time that means like myopic focus on whatever's in front of you, but you forget that if that's all you focused on, you're missing a whole bunch of other things. And I like that little actionable tip because I always try to bring things out for our audience, that things they can take with them that aren't super complicated. And just the simple, like change the radio station, do a different playlist on Spotify, or as simple as like drive a different way home, right?
Yeah.
It's an interesting way to get the dichotomy in your brain to change just a little bit and see what else is out there. So I love that. You've alluded to how you've been an entrepreneur for a pretty long time, and you found success. And part of the show I like to talk about with people is how did you kind of get where you got? Not in like I went to college, I did this thing, I got that thing, more just along the lines of like, how did you get into what you got into? Because I think figuring that out is also part of what is difficult for a lot of people, right? And so I like to ask, like, how did you get into your world? Because did you start in marketing and now you've moved into other stuff, or where did you start?
So I started in sales, and job out of college. First, I was in a management trainee program. Told them when I started it, that, hey, when I get done, I wanted to be in sales, for them. And they said, sure, 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 no problem. Then when I finished up, they said, well, you have to be in your 30s to sell for us, right? So I'm like, okay, well, we missed that part, but okay. So then I just kind of started taking a sales job and, did a little operational work, right, to get to that. And then back into sales. And then I went to graduate school while I was still working, which is very, very difficult, but very stimulating. And I think that really was helpful to formulate a lot of my stuff and my thinking. After graduate school, I focused on the marketing side, right? So I figured I had the sales side, right? Person to person, but I needed to kind of do one to many selling or learn about different media and learn about different positioning and all the stuff that they teach you high level in an MBA program, but not really in the trenches. So I was very fortunate. I had a board member that knew of me and knew of the work I was doing and knew me from graduate school. And he recommended me for an organization. I became their director of marketing. And they were very good to me. It was a phenomenal run. And so I did that, then became VP of marketing and kind of learned the language and, made the commercials on set and made the radio commercials and, hired a big time ad firm. And so it was a lot of fun, but a lot of work. And then, you're bold and you're brash and you're in your 30s and you think you've done it all. So we started, a business, which was we started our advertising agency. And we thought we'd work in one industry, but then we kind of gravitated to a couple different others. And then some economic, it was right during 2008, 2009. I was heavy in the home improvement, home services. And so then we had a whiplash to other industries, right? Because you had to pivot because those people weren't spending. And so we kind of found some niches that a lot of places weren't doing in this early age of the internet. And what do I mean by that? Nowadays, direct response websites are in vogue. Everybody does them, right? You'll capture the information, capture the leads, put a funnel behind that. But I was trained, not only as a classical marketer, but also as a direct response marketer. And so we started doing direct response websites for people and then kind of having funnels and having multi-touch funnels that a lot of businesses, especially the small businesses, weren't thinking of that. Now that's just standard course, right? And everybody does it that way. So, we did that. I wanted to grow the business. So I took on some partners, took on some investors. We bought some products. We brought some services to kind of bring into play. So it allowed us to grow fast. But because I had lost control, if you will, right? Complete equity. I only had 33% of the company. It was time, that the investors wanted to get their money out, which I respect. And couple of the partners wanted to get their money out. So, it triggered a sale and we sold the company. And then I went to go work for a education company that was focused on small businesses. And we did marketing education as well as sales education. So long story, and we'll fast forward today. While I was there, it was for 8 years, and it was private equity owned because I wanted to learn that side of the business of dealing with private equity firms. We found a niche, which is now my company, because most business owners could figure out the marketing side, but where they all had pain was on the sales side of salespeople, the personalities, them selling one month, not selling the next. And so they didn't know how to manage that. So I found the niche, we kind of built it out and built out some IP there. And we've been running ever since and actually still work with a lot of the original clients that were part of that original company. So that's a long story. We go deeper into that, but that's kind of how I got into what we do today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a few entrepreneurs and founders who just, stumble on the first thing, right? They build something
Yeah.
and it turns into Facebook. It does happen. But most of them kind of have a very non-linear journey. They've tried different things and they stumble on something or work hard for something specific, but like that works for them, whether it's a passion or an idea. And so I think your journey is not unique in that way in some, but I will ask, something you pulled out in there that I want to talk a little bit more about is how did you decide that you wanted to go out on your own, right? Because
Yeah.
you're in this company, you're doing really well, you've made kind of maybe a senior level role, the risk of like starting the business and putting money into it and trying to find people and trying to get clients and all the rest of it, I think is hard for a lot of people to even grasp that you can do that. How did you figure that out? How did you learn to leap?
So I had go back to some of my early years, right? I had a mentor and he became an investor in one of my companies, but he a mentor. and he was an entrepreneur, right? And was always doing different things, but he had a kind of core business and didn't doing other stuff. And I remember I was sitting in the parking lot of his office building once. We were going in, and we kind of pulled in at the same time. And I was just talking. I said, you know, when do you stop being afraid? He goes, Nick, I've been doing this my whole life. He goes, I'm afraid every day. He goes, I'm afraid every day. And I remember being a young man in high school and, kind of in the neighborhood I grew up in, there was a lot of small business owners, right? I kind of gravitated toward them. And I remember I was dating one gentleman's daughter, and he was very nice to me and very, he taught me a lot. And, while we were waiting, he would always talk business, and I liked business. And I said, what's it like? He said, every day you make the sign of the cross and you go in, right? And so there's that fear every day that I think kind of pushes you. And I think, Sal, if you think about the other side, I think entrepreneurial is maybe a little less risky than being in one company, because the company, in this last 2 weeks alone, flagship companies are announcing 11,000 people laid off, 15,000 people laid off. Those aren't the line level people that are doing the work. Those are the high level managers that are making good money, with good packages, that they're just saying, hey, I don't need this. Maybe I could go flatter, right? Maybe AI is going to take some of these roles away. And so I think we all have to kind of think entrepreneurial. If you think about how our country was founded, right, it really was the entrepreneurial spirit, right, the ultimate entrepreneurial spirit. And I think we've gotten away from that. You mentioned a couple of people I think it's very important that we go back to, especially your audience, if they're thinking about becoming an entrepreneur, which I think everybody should at least go through the mental gyrations of it, is, Bill Gates. Bill Gates was a great of saying, here is something, let me make it a little bit better and take it to the masses, right? He didn't create MS-DOS. They bought MS-DOS, right? He didn't create WordPerfect. He bought another product. They didn't create Excel. There was another product. So they would buy it or they would mirror and manage it. Another phenomenal entrepreneur, the Walton family, Sam Walton. Sam Walton worked for what was then, I think, Benjamin Franklin 5 at 10 stores, right? And saw how to do it a little bit better. So I think for many people, going back to how we kind of started, just keeping your eyes open and saying, maybe this could be done a little bit better, right? They all probably thought the guy raising canes was crazy just to sell chicken, but he's just doing chicken, and he's doing what, $3 billion. The company is that, right? And so I think, especially with the law, the lawyers, I think many of them have the capacity to be really phenomenal entrepreneurs because they have systems thinking, right? They're taught to think and look at it from all angles, and they do mitigate risk maybe a little bit too much, but I think that they have that ability to think entrepreneurial, and kind of just take the risk. So there isn't a day that goes back to my friend, goes back to my mentor. There aren't days that you're not scared, but you just kind of have to put your cowboy boots on and get on the horse and keep going, because I think there's solace in doing the work, right? There's solace in filling the pipeline every day. There's solace of going out and figuring out new marketing angles and new lead generation angles and new little pockets to service to and connect to. But you sometimes I think we entrepreneurs don't do the work, right? They kind of fall back or just want things to happen, and you don't. You have to kind of push every day. I remember I was in the audience, and somebody was being interviewed, a very well-established entrepreneur, and the female that was interviewing him said, what do you say to the entrepreneur that says, when can I stop marketing? When can I stop selling? When can I stop pushing? He goes, that's the day you shut the business down. He goes, you have to do this every day. Listen, I'm pointing one finger. I got four going back at me. I got to be reminded of that every day. What did I do to fill the funnel, right? What did I do to reach out to a new customer? What did I do to look for a new, service line that we could bring to the marketplace? So I think you have to think that way as an entrepreneur.
There's a lot of good stuff there that I want to pull
Maybe
out.
too much.
I think this idea of fear being a bad thing, of risk or failure being a bad thing, is something that entrepreneurs tend to learn is really the best part, kind of, is that while success is phenomenal and you obviously need it to sustain your life and the rest of it, you actually learn more out of failure than out of any success. And you get comfortable with the idea that you're going to try, and some percentage of what you're going to try is not going to work, but that's an okay thing, right? And I think in my world of legal, it tends to be very binary. They look at it as, okay, we either won or we lost. And if we lost, it's a very bad thing. Instead of just simply as it's an iteration factor, right? Like, let's try, let's see what happens. We'll learn from that. And if it's great, phenomenal. If it fails, we'll learn more from there and keep moving forward. And so I wanted to make sure we pulled that out because I think it's something I hear a lot is fear is good, right? Like it's a good human emotion to make sure you don't, get eaten by some giant animal somewhere, but it's also a factor that you can control and you can manage and you can learn how to move forward. And so I love pointing that out. And then something else you said there I think is important is even if you're not going to go start a business and you can see how to make something a little bit better in your own company, right? That is still entrepreneurial and it is a willingness to go try. I've had somebody else on my show who, he took on a project to fix contracts that was like nobody wanted because he thought I can do it a little bit better. What's the worst that happened? It failed. It was already a failure, right? But he made it better and it allowed him to, jump his career and all those kinds of things. And so I also wanted to pull that out, which is it doesn't have to be a transformational change to the world. It can simply just be a little bit better. And so I'm curious for you. I know you talk about consistency a lot. I know you talk about process and you talked about systems. I think that's difficult for a lot of people. They are an employee and they kind of get told how things work instead of sort of on their own thinking through how to go about doing that. And so if I'm somebody and I want to be more entrepreneurial, I want to start my own company, how do I get good at that sort of like systems building and the consistency?
Start by being bad,
I love that.
right? Start by being bad. And you realize that really everything is a systems and a process, right? And I think we talked maybe in our initial conversation, we look for the constraint, right? So where's the constraint in the system, in the process? Where is it breaking down? And there's going to be multiple steps of where it's breaking down, but you have to kind of figure out one, solve for it, keep going, solve for it, find the next one, solve for it. Maybe some of it goes into my early education. I started out in computer science, computer programming, right? That was my father was in that field. It was blowing up, right? I'm going to age myself, right? This was the 80s, late 80s. And so it was really, really big. I got very lucky that I went to go visit U of I with thinking that I was going to transfer there and to visit my cousin. And one of my cousins was dating a phenomenal programmer, right? So he took me to the lab where all these guys were doing some great stuff at U of I. Think about Netscape came out of that. These guys were the beginning to Big Blue, right? The original AI that beat the chess champion. From that weekend on, I knew I never was going to be great. Those guys were at a level so much higher. So then what did I do? I went to business school, right? And kind of read a marketing book and said, okay, I like this, right? But I had the training as, a systems process thinking, right? If you think about, you flow chart it out, right? If then models and X and Y, we learned on COBOL and CBase and BASIC and all that. I don't want to bore the audience, but much like the legal, right? There's a foundational language that they are taught. That's the legal aspects of things. But there's also a systematic thinking, right? There's a rhyme and a reason to everything. But there's also ways to improve, right? And there's also systematized ways that you can improve. And that thinking, I think, is your basis. And then from there, you take that thinking to business, right? So if you have a lawyer, he's got a thought process that he has. He could take that to look at a business and saying, what are they missing, right? Where are the gaps? Where are things missing in the way, or where's the constraint to their growth? Let me try to fix that for them, or let me fix it on my own, or let me divide the skill set to fix it to many people so I can become a consultant or a operations person that could bring it through. And so I think everybody's taught a certain way, especially in the professional services, a certain way of thinking, and use that as your superpower, but take that to other businesses, other industries, other ways to approach it. And I love the work that you're doing on the podcast of really getting them to think like business people, even if it's for a weekend, right? Just to kind of think of it and say, this isn't for me. Let me get out, right? I just think it's such a powerful way of what's different and what's possible right? And what can I think through? Many of us go to the grave with the music still in us, right? And I think that's what you're trying to do is let people play that music that's in them. And many of them probably want to do it, but just are hesitant for fear, right? For, hey, listen, I got kids in school. There's a lot of reasons why we can't, but I would say sometimes there's a lot of reasons why you cannot not. So you got to do it.
Yeah, it's funny, whether it's LinkedIn now, although it's kind of getting its own jaded world, or social media before that, or it was business books or whatever, there were these business books that, like, on its face, once you've done business a little bit, it's kind of like obvious. There's obvious frameworks, obvious mantras, and you're like, man, how did that sell 6 million or how did that get 100 million likes? And I think as I've learned, it kind of comes back to one, frameworks aren't bad, right? Mantras aren't bad. They really help guide you in what you're doing. And there's also a huge, huge amount of people who want just a little bit of guidance, right? It's hard for them to get started, but if you give them a little guidance on where they're trying to go, that can really help them. And so part of what I'm trying to do here is bring a lot of that business sense, some of that business frameworks into the legal industry. And yes, there are a lot of very successful entrepreneurs and business people in legal, but as a whole, there's just not as many. And so I think it applies because another thing I've always loved, and I just believe it's true, the Charlie Munger incentives drive the world, right? And I think understanding how that impacts whatever job you're in is really important, right? I got stuck in that when I was a young lawyer, not understanding how my firm made money, right? And just kind of going through and getting frustrated when things didn't go my way. If I would have just taken 5 minutes to understand like how they made money, it would have made a lot of sense, right? And so I love that you brought that up because I think it's really important to understand that in whatever you're doing, there's some constraint and incentive guiding that thing. And so helping you move that forward is important. But as you said, everybody can do it, right? You can learn it. And even if you don't become an entrepreneur and start a business, you can better understand how to do your job, how to benefit the company, how to do the rest of it. Something else you brought up there earlier that I think ties into this is this idea of failure, this idea of like, how do you move forward? And you mentioned it. You started your company, 2008 happens, and okay, great, right? And more recently than that, we had the pandemic, right? And where it's like, okay, I'm not really sure what this is going to be. And a lot of people shut down. You looked around and you pivoted and you said, okay, well, what else can we do? How did you learn how to do hard things? Because like, even as you discussed, right? Something like dyslexia. I have a couple friends that have dealt with it. It's very difficult, right? You can get like kind of shut down. How did you learn that skill? Because I think a lot of people struggle with it.
It's a great question. And I don't know if like you ever learn how to deal with it. I think you're just in it and you just have to kind of solve it. So, I mean, I referenced three different companies that we started. I think you got to just say, hey, listen, let me not start a company anytime Nick does. Because we started 2001 is when I started my first company, which we remember what happened with that. 2006, we started the agency. From 2006 to 2008, I thought I was the smartest person in the world, realizing that it was just money was just floating around, very inexpensive money. I became 2008 and 2009 not all that smart, so you kind of had to pivot and fight through. And then we started the firm right before the pandemic. Actually, it was unfortunately for many, it was horrible. For us, it was an accelerator of the business, right? Because people had to think about differently how to sell. People were going to virtual selling. They've never done that. So that became an accelerator. So that one was, we were lucky. That was timing. I like to say that I could time the market. I can't because my stock portfolio would be a lot larger. But I think what you have to do is, one is, I think you're teaching people how to think, how to fight through. One is, I kind of grew up making cold calls. So when I had to go back to making cold calls, I didn't know any better. So I just went and did it, right? You just picked up the phone, sent out letters. We did email blasts. Now the email boxes are filled, right, with garbage, but we were early to do that so that, it's not the one thing you do to break the boulder, it's the 15 things you do, right? So you kind of have to say, what are the 7 things I can do to move the business forward? And I have to do those every day. Now, at the end of the week, you kind of say, did I do them, right? Because, the old analogy, we used to teach entrepreneurship in one of my companies. And the old analogy is everybody thinks they could They don't need a boss. They don't want a boss. They're tired of a boss, right? The two main drivers, not for lawyers, but for other people, of why they want to be an entrepreneur, they hate the commute and they don't like their boss, right? If you go back and study this. Well, the problem is that now they became a boss and they can't fire themselves, and they're the worst employee possible, right? So you kind of have to say, what do I need to do every day to get things to happen? And I think you've alluded to this, and you do this work on your podcast. Is the number one thing you have to do is figure out, how does my firm make money? Your firm is now yourself, right? So how does my firm make money going out and acquiring new contracts, new people, new clients, and then servicing that work, doing good work to referral? But I can't forget step one, because sometimes in entrepreneurs, what we do is we go get the contract or go get the client, but that's only one client. We're servicing that client. We're not filling that funnel. So I got to go back to step one every day. What's the constraint of my growth? Is I'm not filling the funnel every day. When we talk to people, I could tell intuitively when a business, now I've been just doing this long enough, when I just look at the pipeline reports, right, for people, or I look at the conversion reports, right? We do some work with law firms and I look at how many inbound leads are coming, how many are they converting? Well, if I could just make that 10%, 20%, and then make 20%, 30%, right? So just figure out the constraints and just work it out, it's going to be better. And so I think you have to think about that every day, is what's the number one role? Well, I think it's Bill Ackman, and I don't know why, but I've been latched onto this quote, right? If we all want to eat, somebody got to sell, right? That was his first partner that told him that when he first started his hedge fund. If we all want to eat, somebody's got to sell. And so as you as the entrepreneur, you as the lawyer that's thinking about doing this, you have to say, can I do this? Will it paralyze me so I can't? And if the answer is yes, then you have to say, who can I find? Who can I employ? Who can I partner with that could do this? The reciprocal of that, my second firm, which was the advertising marketing firm, I had to get somebody in to take care of the back office, right? To take care of the invoicing, to take care of the contracts, to make sure that the collections happen. Because I was running and gunning so much on the front end of just client acquisition that fell behind. That's not my sweet spot. So I brought a partner in to focus on that. That became all the difference too. So I think you have to look at the yin and the yang, right? What's my business development, but then what's my fulfillment, and then what's my finance?
I think a couple things there are really important to pull out. One is that in any job, there's things you don't like. You have stuff you don't want to do, and as you kind of alluded to it, it often is you don't like your manager, or you don't like your community, whatever it might be. And so there's a little bit of, especially in the U.S., of lionizing this idea of entrepreneurship and building companies, and then it's all roses, right? The classic, like on LinkedIn, I always joke
Oh
around,
yeah.
like the 12-year-old who has started a SaaS and made $7 million, and you're like, okay, one, that's fake, but two, it doesn't. There's more to it than that, right? And I think part of that is that within any business, there's a whole bunch of stuff too that, like, you and I don't love doing. It just has to get done. And I think sales is an interesting one to talk a little bit more about, because it's like classic. I want to cold call. I don't want to send emails that are a little bit too forward. I don't want. And in the legal industry, we kind of like to talk about it as a profession, as
Mhm.
a
Sure.
something that is above reproach, where
Mhm.
I sort of call bullshit on that all the time. There are great reasons why lots of lawyers do good stuff, but at the end of the day, it's still like any other business. It needs to make money. It has to run. It has to all the things. So you can do anything good beyond your job, whatever it might be. And I think one thing I always like to talk about is, like, you have to get comfortable either, and you said it perfectly, either you just getting over yourself and trying and doing things, or building a team around you, right? Delegating, figuring out the people that can do that. And so I'm curious on learning to do it yourself and just getting over it. I think it's very difficult to teach. You just have to go try. But I think on the delegation part, you can learn, and especially the hiring part. And you've run multiple companies and you've had to think about who you bring on, whether it's partners or investors or employees. And I'm curious, how did you learn to find the right people in the right roles? Because I think that's another thing a lot of people struggle with when they're trying to build teams internally or build a company externally.
It's a great question. So one point I want to make, and then I'm going to go to this.
Yeah.
You said something that was phenomenal that I want to double down on because I think people have to understand this. And one is our audience is lawyers, and so there's an affinity not to want to advertise. But I think you have to realize that for the person that you're going to service, your ad, if done right, if done proper, if done well positioning, is the most important message that they're going to hear that day, right? The person that is struggling with a problem, right? Because we did a lot of work with a big law firm, and they said most legal problems really are human behavior problems, right? We just chose to drink too much and we got in our car. God forbid we don't kill anybody, but now I got a problem, right? Now this person is at the right time leading your message. And the only way they're going to know about you is in some way, shape, or form, advertising, marketing, referral, whatever that is, it all kind of forms into that. So I wanted to lump onto that because I think you did a great point, and I think people should have to get over that. We think about the 99 people out of 100 that don't respond to our message. That's not it. It's the one that heard it at the right time, that it was the right thing, and that we've now, through our skill set, are able to help somebody. That we'll leave that be. So to answer your question, nowadays it's phenomenally easier to build a team, especially 1099, especially independent contractors. There's so many great platforms, Sal, right? You Upworks, you have so many different people. It's also an environment where people are used to gig economies, right? So you don't have to go out and hire people full time. You just say, here's my project. Here's what I want to do. There's platforms to post it up and we can put it in the show notes. There's 1,000 of them out there. But the other thing too is what we're doing a lot of work with for certain tasks is offshoring. And it is so inexpensive. And the talent is so good. If you don't want to sell, there are phenomenal Latino, call centers that are very inexpensive where you could go find the talent for fraction of what you spend that are great. Philippines are good for certain things. They're not as aggressive on the selling. South African, phenomenal for selling, right? So you could find these people. LinkedIn, horrible, right? I call it the Lake Wobegon. Everybody's making $1 billion. Everybody's great. I watched a video the other day of a kid, he had to be 20, right? And he says he's the largest $1 billion advertising agency in Switzerland. I'm like, well, first off, I know like 5 that are bigger than you, right? And come on. But, listen, you got a camera and you get a microphone. Everybody could be the greatest. I realize that. But I mean, you could find talent just on LinkedIn. If you search right through Search Navigator or through other things, the people that will do whatever it is that you don't want to do or that you need. So a lot of great sources to find people and start small. Don't think you have to put them on salary. Figure out what you could afford to pay, and you'll find the people that do it. It used to be, I won't even tell you what my first website cost, right? When my first companies. Now I could get it done in a weekend for less than $1,000, and it does the same thing. And it's just amazing out there of what talent is there. The world is flat, right? I know it's round, but the world is flat when it comes to finding talent. So go out and find talent, and don't be afraid to use international sources. Don't be afraid to use gig work and that type of thing. Protect yourself and protect your IP. Certainly, most people that are listening are legal, so they'll understand that. But have really good documentation. So
Yeah, I think a couple things there is that I've learned, offshoring has a negative connotation for a lot of
does it?
people,
Okay, yeah.
right? And I think, we're in this world right now where it's like America first and all this
Yeah.
stuff, right? And it's this idea. But one of the things that, because, I use a lot of, you know, contractors, partners, and businesses as you do. And I've had, people who worked for me when I worked for larger companies in India and the Philippines and all over the place. And one thing I learned was that, it's often our perception that they are not getting paid well. And yes, it does exist. There are bad situations. I'm not going to pretend they're not. But I've learned that, if you can find somebody that's really talented, you can pay them what is a phenomenal salary, wage, whatever it might be for them in their country. And they are ecstatic. And as long
Yeah.
as you are a good manager, a good team member, not a total asshole, then it's a good win-win situation, right? And so I wanted to point out that, it doesn't have to be this I'm exploiting somebody else somewhere else. It actually can be just a win-win for everybody. And I think the other thing about it is the point you made, you can try stuff.
Mhm.
Hiring is difficult. And if you hire somebody on as an employee, it has all kinds of rules and regulations, which is generally fine. I get it. It's good. But that means if you get it wrong, there's a huge cost associated with it. And
Yeah.
so trying something out, I think, is important. So I wanted to bring that up. But beyond that, I think the idea behind this and sort of what you've been talking about, delegating, finding people to fill roles that maybe you're not the best at, figuring out your superpower and double downing on that is this idea of leverage. And I like to talk about that too because I think it's something you can do both as an entrepreneur but also just working within a company is the reason technology, the reason systems work is because you get leverage that you can't do on your own, right? And it's a time function. You only have so much time in the day, and you should be spending your time on the absolute best thing you do because that'll give you the best returns. And so figuring out where that leverage point is really important. And so, I'm curious as you've developed your systems for sales, for your companies, how have you guided your clients to think about, where does that time go and how do you figure it out so you get the best leverage for the money you spend, the time you put in?
So I forget the person to attribute the quote to, but give me a lever and fulcrum large enough, and I can move the world, right? So it's just about leverage. So I think it goes back to what are your talents, right? And I think everybody should do. There's Gallup, right? And I think they do talent assessment. I think everybody should look at that. There's different things of, I forget the name of it, and the it's a book, but then it's also a learning course of who are you as an entrepreneur? Are you a builder? Are you a what are you at? And so kind of figure out who you are. Even if you're not an entrepreneur, you should take those to kind of see where you're at and where your skill set is. And I think what you have to do with systems and processes and using leverage is realizing that if you don't constantly maintain it and make it better and monitor it, it will revert back to the mean, right? So we do this work all the time with salespeople was we put a new process in place. But it has to be coached, it has to be managed, it has to be, I got lucky. I worked for right out of graduate school. They taught us systems and processes, right? And the name escapes me, with the gentleman that was the consultant that went to Japan after World War II, but what you kind of built systems and processes. It says processes and systems will be people all the time, but we want to just focus on the people, right? And a lot of times you walk in and you say, "Oh, XYZ isn't happening." I'm like, "XYZ isn't happening because your process isn't happening, right? Your systems aren't happening." So you kind of have to create them, and then also realize you have to manage them, right? It's a living, organized. It will morph, and people will go and flow back to what they know. So you kind of have to keep on pushing, pushing, pushing. There's some great books that kind of get you to think system wise. One of them was Complications by Atul Grande, right? Which is, he kind of did checklist and thinking through systems and processes. And if you think about places where you have great harm can happen if you're not focusing on processes and systems and then just taking that and applying that to your business. An airplane can't go off unless there's that, 144 checklist, right? A surgery can't happen. How many times do they ask you what's your date of birth and who you are and what leg are we operating on, right? They're not doing it just because they want to see if you're awake. They're doing it because there's a systems and process, and because if they don't do it, something bad will happen. So I think you have to think systematized and then just realize, okay, I'm going to build it, I'm going to build it, I'm going to build it, I'm going to build it. But sometimes you also have to say, I'm going to build it, I'm going to test it. I'm going to build it, and I'm going to test it and test it. Because it will revert, if you're using other people other than yourself, it will revert to the mean.
I think also, I tried to explain why systems and processes is so important is that, a lot of people get caught up in that. It's going to take me 45 minutes, an hour, 4 hours to like map out this process for a 15-minute thing. I'll just do the 15-minute thing. And they get lost in this idea of, I can just do it now and it's a waste instead of yes. But when you take that thing and you create a system and a process around it, somebody else can do it. Or you can then leverage it inside of technology and take that off your plate entirely. And I think it's an interesting thing to talk about because in this age of AI, that is kind of a lot of what's going on is, AI is really mapping out things that it gets taught or used in how you apply it and go forward. And I think having that skill to think about how you do your job, how you execute against whatever you're going forward with is actually really important. A lot of people don't take the time to really think through why they do what they do. I joke around, you should like record yourself all day talking out loud, and you'd be shocked at how much stuff you do that you can systematize in a way that will offload your day. How did you get good at that process mapping or that thing, that skill?
Well, some of it is I was kind of trained to do it. Sometimes, so interesting. I have a client that they realized when they got really serious about their business, they wanted to create systems and processes in their business. And what they've done then is their core business, they've packaged those systems and process it, and they have a secondary business line that they sell those systems and SOPs and processes to people. So think about it from an entrepreneurial standpoint. You have to do that, right? Because that's a very great way. And what they did, which was genius and easy, is they had interns, college interns, follow them around for a summer. And then they created all the SOPs from that work. And these kids got a really good project, right? These college students got a really good project. And these people now have a business line that's seven figures plus, plus, plus that they sell. And so I think there's two things to think about. One is if you're not good at it, we talked about this, go out and find the talent. Two is there's ways to do this where you're recording yourself and you're thinking things through, and then you could just feed it into AI and it will create the systems and process. So it's a different world now than it was 5 years ago, even 3 months ago. The other thing is that there's programs, right? So I it's up on my other monitor, Lucid Chart, right? I'm flow charting everything. I was just with one of our clients and I was with his tech person and I was kind of flow charting it out and saying, okay, this is dynamic, right? We're going to flow it out together, but let's make it as good as possible. Pay people to do it for you. Here's everything I do, put it in systems and processes. There are people that do this and it's very inexpensive. The other thing though, and because this is for helping people become entrepreneurial, if you ever want to exit your business for a multiple, if you ever want to sell your business, it can't just be what's in your head. You have to have systems and processes because that's what people are buying, right? Here's how we acquire customers. Here's how we service the customers. Here's how whatever it is, that has to be systems and processes. And the smart entrepreneurs will realize that and bake that in on day one so that they could hire the people and set the people up for success so that when they go to sell, somebody's buying a systems and processes and SOPs or whatever that is so that they get a higher multiple. So instead of say 1 times earnings, it's 3 times earnings or 4 times earnings or whatever it is. So you have to do it.
I also think, what's important there is that even if you're not starting your own business, systems and processes will allow you to focus on really what matters in your job, right? I think too many people don't realize that a lot of their work is administrative, moving things, sending this
Sure.
email, tackling this thing, instead of like, where am I spending dedicated, focused domain expertise time on it? And in the legal industry, lawyers generally are overworked. And part of the reason they're overworked is they aren't really building these systems and processes out and thinking about it in a larger faction, right, of how I might go about doing things. And so I think your point is really important there in that spending the time mapping it out, using a tool, working with somebody can really help you generate a bigger return, both in selling your business, if you ever sell a business, but also just in your day to day of like, how do you go about doing things? Because it will give you that leverage that we talked about a little bit ago. And I think that's an important thing I wanted to touch on. I also thought a good conversation is something that I've been talking to a lot about on my show is this idea of community. And you mentioned multiple times, right? Like I had a mentor here, I had a mentor there, I was dating this girl and her dad was just nice to me, right? And I think a lot of that seems to get lost right now, and people are really craving more community. And we talked about it a little bit off the show of there's this kind of epidemic with men and a
Oh, yeah.
lack of that connection. And I've been talking about it because I want people to understand there are people out there. There's people like Nick who are happy to take you to lunch, who just met you and are interested in you and whatever it might be. How have you learned to build community? Because I think it's kind of a hard thing. I mean, even as you mentioned, going to lunch with a group in your neighborhood, right? I
Yeah.
mean, like, how did you learn to do that?
Well, one is, I'm an extrovert, not an introvert, so it's a little bit easier for me, right? Two is we joked a little bit about in the beginning that, around food, I love language of Italians, right? So we like to be around the table. So there's that. Three is, when I was very young and starting my own business, I kind of somebody told me go talk to SCORE, right? And so that was like the antithesis, the beginning of finding mentors and that type of thing. And especially older retired or older senior people want to be mentors. Nowadays, it's more difficult to kind of say, oh, I love to mentor you, right? But if younger people ask them, hey, what would you do in this situation? Or hey, I'm looking, for that. People are very. I find that the higher the person is, the higher their earnings, the more successful they are, the more they'll share. The more they'll share. When I was starting an offshoot of this business prior to it, a guy that did it allowed me to come into his office and see everything, right? If they have an abundance mentality, they will focus on that. So I think you just have to ask, right? I think you just have to do it. I think there's a lot of good sources, but there's a lot of bad sources too, right? So you kind of have to be careful on that. I had a young man 2 or 3 weeks ago reach out to me on LinkedIn, right? I say, listen, I'm a college student. Here's where I go. Here's what I'm doing. I want to be an entrepreneur, but I want, and I'm just looking for people that will have a conversation with me. Like, sure, here's my link, 15 minutes. Let's talk. Well, it turned out that he really wanted to focus on real estate investment and kind of getting into that space. And I'm like, listen, I know nothing about that, but I know 3 people or 4 people that'd be more than happy to talk to you about that. I go, give me your cell phone number. I texted all 3 of them. All 3 of them responded within a day to this young man and said, be more happy to talk to you. Right. So the answer is just go out and ask, right? Start with one. People will focus on that. Ask how you could add value to other people, right? Whether it's, let me open up my Rolodex, let me over this. And so, there's this natural tendency that I can't ask because I don't want to put myself out there, but but people want to help, right? We're wired to help, right? You think about some of the greatest sales lines in the world is, hey, can you help me? Here's what I'm looking for. Do you know anybody that might be a good person for me to talk to? And so if you're starting a business, you got to realize you got to go out and find them, find the ones that are authentic. There's some bad ones out there, but you got to kiss a lot of frogs to find your prince, right? So you got to kind of do that. But, there's just a way to do that. And people are, there are value and, listen, don't be a taker. You got to figure out how to be a giver too, right? Whether it's even write them a nice note, right? Send them a book, right? Something, in the course of the conversation, you realize they like something and send them something, even if it's small, has a gesture that will go a long way too.
Yeah, just add value is like a pretty
Yeah.
simple way to go
Yeah.
about life and not make it so transactional. I feel like too often, you get on a call or you have a conversation and it's like an immediate, this is what I can give you. What can you give me?
Yeah.
Instead of just like, hi, I'm Sal. Nice to
Yeah.
meet you,
Right.
right?
Right. Like,
And, I love the way you talked about that, which is like, just try, I always joke, I take endless calls, right? Like LinkedIn, 15 minutes. And I've learned that when I wasn't doing it because I felt like I just don't have the time or whatever, I always joke around like I have enough friends. I lost a lot of opportunities
yeah.
because opportunity is a little bit of a surface. Like the greater your surface area, the more opportunities you get, and the more you put yourself out there, the more, more stuff comes along. And I think people forget that. And so, even if you're doing nothing but saying hello, and you have just a give value, abundance mindset, it tend to feel like things come back, right? And so, I think that's an important thing to talk about as well.
Well, I think there's 2 things to remember. One is money likes movement, right? So if you want to focus on revenue, you want to focus on making money, you have to have some level of movement. It doesn't like being static. And it's going to go to where it's rewarded and people treat it well. Second thing is I think this is Eisenhower or maybe Schwarzkopf. It's easier to change direction of something that's troops that are moving than to get them started, right? So you just got to get started, and you'll find your pattern of outreach, right? You know how you're like, oh, I tried this 5 times, it didn't work. Let me try it a little different. And I think goes back to where we've both kind of joked, but the joke is truthful of there's so much inauthenticity on LinkedIn that if you're just authentic, I think you will break through the clutter, right? There was one person, I get a lot of messages, I'm sure you do probably more than I do, right? Because you got a podcast too. One person, a great message that person wrote me. It was it was like well written. And I'm like, good for you for not using AI. Good for you for not just sending me some junk. I'll be more than happy to talk to you. I'm not probably a good person for your product or service. I will help you find 2 other people in my network that are, because you took the time to write such an authentic message. And I don't think we do enough of that. I think it's a lot of spray and pray. And I think it's a lot of, I'm the best, I'm the best, I'm the best. And I think there's a lot of phoniness. Some of that's out of desperation, right? You can kind of feel it. But some of it is just because we're mimicking what we think is good behavior. So be authentic and be yourself, but have some level of dignity too.
I love that little nugget. I think that's a great way to talk about it. I think I understand sometimes, you get sort of a little desperate, or
Yeah.
you're not doing well in your job or whatever it might be. And I get it, right? That fear and anxiety, I understand it. But generally speaking, right, I do agree with you that I think authenticity will win in the long run, right? It's kind of the short game, long game. And like, I think the more you do that, the better off you're going to be. Even sometimes when it's hard, right? It's the classic, like, how do you act in in the worst situation versus how do you act in the best situation? And if you're authentic, even in hardship, that comes off. People recognize
Yeah.
that. And another thing you mentioned there, I wanted to chat about, because I know your business now is, sales and helping entrepreneurs move forward, is, you know being kind or giving grace to others. I do the same thing. People reach out and they're like, I have this great thing I want to sell you. And I'm always like, you know what? That I'm not actually in the market for that thing, but I appreciate your time.
Yeah.
I'm thankful, and getting back to them. And it's surprising how many those salespeople actually respond and are like, you know what? Thank you. I don't have to waste my time now calling you 100 times or whatever it might be. And I think that's important. So I wanted to touch a little bit on sales. Even if say you're starting a law firm, or you have a legal tech company, or whatever it might be, how do you go about thinking through how you're getting customers, how you're acquiring people? Like, what should I be thinking about in that path forward for me?
That's a great question. So, first off, who is, in marketing terms, my words, not the market's, or it's my ideal customer profile, right? My ideal customer avatar. Who is the best person for my product and services, right? And if once you have that, you can now create a list, right? The lists are easy to get. LinkedIn, there's a lot of different data sources. You could pay, we pay people all the time in Pakistan or whatever to kind of create our list. Here's our avatar. Here's what we're looking for. To the best of your ability, create this list. If you're just starting out, the next step, which most people forget, is you just may want to reach out to these people and say, hey, listen, here's what I'm thinking. Here's where I think I solve a problem, but I'm looking for some really good advice. And I've been following you from afar, right? Or I've known you for a while, or XYZ and I are connected, and you know XYZ. So I think, can I just want to run something quick past you, right? They may respond, may not respond. You may have to send them another message similar to that. But I think it's going back to the authenticity, right? Of saying, hey, you can't just go saying, hey, want to buy my stuff, want to buy my stuff, want to buy my stuff in the marketplace. That only works in the marketplace of like farm markets, or if we were walking through, Turkey or something in the Grand Bazaar, but it doesn't work in today's marketplace. And so you got to realize, am I solving a problem? What is the problem I'm solving, and how can I solve for X? And is it more effective for them to outsource solving that problem? And is it a big enough problem, right? So we say a lot of time, who owns this KPI, right? Key performance indicator. Who owns this this problem, who owns what, and what are we solving for, and how do we have that conversation with them? And it is a big enough burning issue for them to take the meeting or try to solve it at a high enough level. Because there's low level people that will take meetings all day long because that's what they kind of get paid for, right? And so you're not moving the deal forward. You're just being nice. They're just being nice to people. So you got to solve for X, right? So here's who I like, here's who I have, here's the problems, here's all the alternatives to the problems, including doing nothing, and here's how I'm different. And you go to the marketplace and you start having conversations. And you want to have those as fast and furious as possible, right? And you want to get a handle on, yeah, I think this is something out there in the marketplace, right? Yeah, I think people want to solve this. And don't just take yes and say, well, if you were to solve it with X, which is what I provide, what would you pay for it, right? And if they say $5, but you need to sell it at $20, you got to add some widgets to it, you got to add some whistles and bells to it, or you don't have a business, right? Because now it's just economics. And so I think a lot of times we don't think that through, right? We just go to the marketplace. One is we don't tell our story loud enough, right? We don't tell our story in a compelling manner, but we also aren't focused on the right people, i.e. the problems we want to solve. A lot of times we do a lot of work with customers and they think everybody is their customer. And it's like, you're going to go broke, right? One is you can't afford to get to the masses. Two is it's too expensive. Three is you're going to be churning salespeople because they're talking to cruddy leads all the time, right? So let's define that of who we are. And the best will say, here's who we serve. If you're not XYZ 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we're not the place for you. Try these other places. They're a better source for you. And I think it's okay. You have to be okay with saying, I'm not for everybody, right? And let me get to the right people. And now you're starting to have conversations with the right ideal customer profile, and you could figure out other problems, right? So maybe you could have add-on services or other companies or other things. And that's kind of how you get to where you need to go. It all starts with having really good conversations with your ideal customer profile.
Are you a proponent of this idea of kind of personality driven sales versus consistency in how you optimize a process? I think, especially in kind of one world I live in legal tech, there's this influx of builders now with AI and legal. It's this whole thing. And you have a very like founder led in the beginning, which I think is fine, sales motion, but they have no structure to it. It's very like charisma. I am who I am and I have this vision and you're going to buy into this vision. How do you go about doing that? Because I think, especially when you're small, you can't necessarily go hire, an AE and an SDR and all the rest of it. Just maybe you and a small team. But how do you go about doing that?
So I do like personality, right? I think so. First off, I think it's easier to get a personality driven business off the ground, right? I think it breaks through the clutter, right? I know this is probably the antithesis of some of the other people you may have on your show or other people's philosophies. I do like that, especially if there's a natural charisma, right? That the people will gravitate towards that. And I think you need that sometimes, and you need that hubris to break through, especially in a very crowded marketplace, right? You just kind of push forward and saying, here's where we're at. Where it becomes problematic is when there's nothing behind the veneer, right? When it's just the charisma, and politicians have this problem, right? When it's just that, then we have a problem. So if there's something behind it, if there's we solve for X and we actually solve for X, we solve for Y and we actually solve for X and Y, then I'm all for that. Now what you have to do though is you have to take that founder led, and he's got a way of selling that he intuitively knows. And so you got to bring somebody in to proselytize it, if you will, because he knows that if you ask me a question 3 minutes in about something, I've got to answer this at 8 minutes, because at 30 minutes, when I finish up my presentation, you're going to give me this objection. They just intuitively have done it and they know it, right? But the other thing too is they're so ingrained and passionate about the problems that their mind skips over parts that they intuitively do. So they can't translate that to the sales team. That's where it becomes difficult. Right. So when you're kind of moving from the founder-led organization to the sales or marketing-driven organization, But I'm okay with that. I think you need whatever you can in this today's day and age to break through the clutter. There's so much noise, and I think a really articulate founder is a great way to start. And I think it's a great way for people to have some level of confidence in your product or your service. So I'm okay with it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think with anything, there's a right time for the right thing in the right
Correct.
place, right? And
Right.
you have to figure out where that fits. And I actually think it ties back to what you were talking about a little bit earlier, which is like, I always like to say, technical people don't just build something to build it. Actually, like
Yeah, go figure
figure
out
out,
if there's a
yeah,
problem.
figure
Yeah.
out if there's a problem and figure out if that problem is something people are willing to pay, right? It's
Yeah.
the classic, like, is this a painkiller or is this like, a nice little candy that I get? I don't need it. Or do I absolutely have to have this, right? And so I think that's a big thing.
There's a lot of solutions out there looking for problems versus problems looking for solutions, right? So a lot of people build solutions and they're running around looking for a problem or manufacturing problems. And every now and then we get brought in and we kind of have to say, this is a solution looking for a problem and the marketplace doesn't want it. And everybody gets mad, right? And then you got kind of, but listen, I could take your money forever, but I'm not that kind of guy. And I got to look at myself in the mirror. And so that's what X is. So that is fair. I think there's a lot of great features and benefits, I'll say, but not solutions.
Yeah. And it's a difficult thing. You can get caught up in your own vision and what you think is great. And
Yeah, yeah,
no, I
yeah. Hey,
understand
listen,
it's
that's for
natural.
entrepreneurship, right?
Focusing on that problem set is important, especially
Yeah,
if you want to ever monetize anything. So,
yeah.
I think that's key. Nick, it's been a really great conversation today. I've learned so much. I can't wait until we talk again. I
Sure.
like to close out these shows by asking, is there a nugget you would like the audience to take away today, an actionable tip that they can use as they move forward in their journey?
So you've got a great host in Sal in this podcast, so make sure you listen to it. And the important thing, and I think that what we tried to say is that sometimes the fear is there, but you still got to saddle up, right? And you just got to do it. And then getting the motion, right? Money loves motion, and that will cause you to get on your entrepreneurial journey or you to think differently about a problem. And I also think that, especially we're recording this and we're coming up to Thanksgiving, there was a group of people that probably didn't want to leave the countries that they left to come to America, but they chose to. And many times we don't want to leave the careers that we're in or the businesses that we're in or the companies that we're in, but we know we have to. We know it's the right thing to do. And so we kind of have to forge ahead and do that.
I think that is a fantastic, actionable nugget to end the show today. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's a joy. Thank you for hosting.
If you want to continue building your entrepreneurial mindset and enjoy our content, we would love for you to subscribe, hit the bell, follow along. You can also find us on our Substack, PossibLaw. Abrazos!